Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Welcome to the fifth session of the Center's Religion and series. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and thinkers in multiple fields hosted by the Center to continue these critically important conversations about religion and American studies and the contemporary moment. The first four episodes were dynamic and thought-provoking discussions on issues and questions, looking at issues as wide-ranging as vaccine protocols and public rituals of the state. All of these episodes and hot takes from them are available on the Center's website and can be found at our YouTube channel, and they can be used for a number of varieties, and we've seen people use them for teaching and for engagement in their classroom. I want to thank the scholars who took time out of their schedules to provide nuanced and engaged discussions, to challenge the fields of religion and American studies, and to really push us forward as we think about these critical issues during this important time in our history. Thank you again, Nicole and Elaine and Christy and Ray for last month's discussion. Thank you for joining us today. And we hope that you will join us every third Thursday at 3 p.m. as we discuss topics that look at the relationship between religion, the pressing issues of our day, and the impact or their impact on the fields that we study. Today, however, I'm excited to introduce our fifth session, which examines religion and reimagining Black futures. As you read, the field of Africana religious studies has undergone significant reappraisal in the last 10 to 15 years. Specifically, the field has begun to actively and from an interdisciplinary perspective engage the idea of futurity and Afro-diasporic futures. Scholars from across the spectrum are advancing new approaches to understanding the human condition and social institutions in an age of intelligent machines, social media, and technological innovation. In today's panel, we will look at emerging approaches to Black futures in the fields of religious studies and American studies, and how approaches from new media, social sciences, and even brain sciences have opened new models for studying and thinking about Black religious future. Please remember that throughout today's session, we are asking folks to submit their questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom. This will enable our host and panelists to engage those questions as we facilitate this important conversation. So you can use the chat room for your own conversations, but for the questions that we're going to engage, please use the Q&A function. Now, let me introduce my co-host, and we will move into this afternoon's conversation. I am honored to be joined by my co-host, Dr. Sylvester Johnson, the founding director of the Virginia Tech Center for Humanities, who is a internationally recognized humanities scholar specializing in the study of technology, race, religion, and national security. His award-winning scholarship is advancing new approaches to understanding the human condition and social institutions of power in an age of intelligent machines and other forms of technological innovation. Dr. Johnson's latest book, and the one that I was talking about actually last night, is African American Religions, 1500 to 2000, Colonialism, Democracy, and Freedom. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Johnson, and he's going to introduce our other two panelists for today's discussion.
Thanks very much. Really excited to be here, and I'm delighted to join the program and to welcome our two guests, Dr. Melanie Harris and Dr. Corey Miles. Dr. Harris is a professor of religion and the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Texas Christian University. As a former American Council of Education Fellow and a graduate of the Harvard Leadership Program, Dr. Harris's research focuses on inclusive excellence, access, and equity in higher education and ethical leadership. Her scholarship has critically examined the intersections of race, religion, gender, and environmental ethics. She's the author of many scholarly articles and books, including Eco-Womanism, African American Women's Earth, Honoring Faith, also Faith, Feminism, and Scholarship, and Gifts of Virtue, Alice Walker and Womanist Ethics. We're delighted to have you with us today, Dr. Harris.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Yes. And also Dr. Corey Miles. Dr. Miles is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Morgan State University in Baltimore. So his research examines the role of Black aesthetics in transforming structures of oppression, particularly the criminal justice system. He's a recipient of a 2018-2019 American Sociological Association Minority Fellowship and the 2018-2019 Diversity Fellowship at Augustana College. Additionally, his authored work in scholarly journals ranges from examinations of Black feminist subjectivity in trap music to empirical explorations of the intersections of media and state violence towards Black bodies. As an engaged activist for All Black Lives, Corey does collaboratively community organizing, and he speaks at campus and community events in an ongoing effort to humanize the structural conditions of Black people. Dr. Miles, welcome. Excited to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
So today's show is examining the nexus between religion and reimagining Black futures. So let's get started.
All right. I'm so excited to have you all here. And I want to just open up with a kind of a broad question that I want the panelists and Dr. Johnson to answer. And I want to think about for a minute, what are we talking about when we're using the term Afrofuturism or Black futures or futurity? And why is that term or that idea important or suggestive for the work that you are doing? I'm going to start with Dr. Harris, and then we'll go to Dr. Miles. So, but I want to, why this term and why now?
Thank you so much. And thanks for everyone for being here. It's a gift indeed to be with you all. Dr. Edmonds, it's a good question. I think that this conversation is a needed one, particularly in this moment and particularly in this particular time. I think when I think about Black futures specifically, I do think about Black womanhood and what that has meant, the kind of contours of Black feminism, the places and the questions that we have started and where we and how far we still have to go. I think in this particular moment, as we think about Black Lives Matters, as we think about the founders of Black Lives Matters and the kind of intersectional and interdisciplinary ways of being in that movement, what we recognize is that the categories that we have used as a people and even in Black intellectual thought are not broad enough, basically, to create a space for what we need now. It is the case that I think we have a moment and an opportunity right now to think about Black futures in a way that necessitates us using different categories, reimagining different categories, so that the work that we do, the categories that we use, the discourse that we're having can in fact meet activists 50 to 100 years from now in a really important, valid way. There is a sense in which the split of many Black churchgoers and the Black Lives Matters movement is still with us. That is to say that in some ways, the ways of thinking of Black liberation theology, even the ways of thinking about the Black civil rights movement was not wide enough, was not big enough to hold everyone and to honor everyone's identity who identifies as African or part of the African diaspora. So the challenge, I think, as we think about moving forward into thinking about Black futures means what kinds of categories do we need to come up with in the study of religion and the study of Black religion and the study of African-American studies in order to create a space for the future of Black intellectual thought. And I add the thought here, recognizing that it actually may be plural, right? That there may be a very, very deep sense that the kind of interdisciplinary work that we are beginning to do now with all of the different, disciplines as you've just named earlier, they will actually be crucial for us even being able to exist together in conversation. I think one of the gifts of Black Future is to really dig into the hope that we are one. These very, very deep and old understandings of Ubuntu. The very, very important understandings that we are one people, to be able to be one people and to have all of our people fed and well-resourced, et cetera. That too is hope for a Black future.
And I really love what you said just now, Dr. Harris, particularly thinking about Black future and centering Black women, and it opens up a space to think about what does it mean to queer the future. And so for me, when I position or engage or think about Black futures, to me, it poses then the question, what does it mean to talk about a future for a group of people who were never supposed to survive the past? And I'm thinking in conversations with sociologists and Black studies scholars who are engaged in conversations on temporal inequality. So if we're thinking about the future as being part of a construct of time, And then so we can think about then certain forms of temporal inequality, such as how history is often calibrated or told by white logics. Black people get written out of time. Or think about how Black folks have to work twice as hard to get equal or less than whites, right? We lose time. Or facts such as Black women and men have some of the shortest life expectancies in America, the ways in which we're denied time. So then I want to problematize time, where thinking about the past and the futures both as social constructions that become animated through white logics and structures of oppression. And then so time itself then is anti-Black. Black future then is a critique of both how we remember the past, where society would tell us that Black people are ahistorical and never move towards a future. And also it allows us to chart new possibilities of what may come. So as a trap music scholar, I center my engagement on performance. And so then thinking about performance and music as a site of both being in the future in relation to those who didn't survive, and also charting and imagining of a more ontologically sincere way of moving to the past. And then so for me, Black future critiques the linearity of time. So it critiques the idea that time is just this straightforward path. And so for me, hip hop then exists as both the future of slave narratives and the past for the music that is yet to come. I exist in the future of my mother who survived the anti-Black structure long enough to birth me, and I exist in the past of the children who are yet to come. And thinking in conversation with scholars such as Calvin Warren, who also critiques temporal linearity, suggesting that when we look at different periods of time, what we've often been doing is comparing different forms of anti-Blackness. And so for me, Black futures points to a way forward and a way back. Black future is a method to reimagine ways in which we can engage and study Black people, Black lives, and how we can make Black love.
Now, that's very, very evocative of you both to raise these issues and these approaches. When I listened to your musing about the importance of thinking critically of the power relationships in time, the temporality itself, Dr. Miles, as a concern for equity, and Dr. Harris, your attention to the importance of understanding the multiple trajectories and the deep traditions from Ubuntu and Ford about a unified humanity in this context. It makes me wonder how each of you understands the possibilities and usefulness of futurity for some of the disciplinary work and say metadisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and then beyond academic public impact work that comes up in different areas of scholarship. I'm thinking about individuals such as Anthony Penn, Ruha Benjamin have written about technology and race, for example. Safia Noble's attention to issues of algorithmic justice. There's a lot of work on environmentalism, and particularly the very serious, urgent plight that we're dealing with as a planetary system that is in the news today. We have these very powerful weather systems that actually have something to do with anthropogenic issues. And as we think about the future tense of those issues, I'm wondering how each of you might reflect on what futurity might offer for the work that's done in studies of race and gender and religion.
Thank you so much. And I'm so appreciative. I appreciate the setup for the question, but also Dr. Miles, some of the themes that you've opened up here in terms of this more cyclical way, or perhaps a spiral way of thinking about time, but really critiquing time. I'll start with the question, Dr. Johnson, that you posed, particularly around environmental justice, and in part because on this day, I happen to be located in Fort Worth, Texas, and Texas itself as a state has seen record low temperatures. And in Texas, it's very uncommon for us to see this kind of weather pattern. And in fact, what people, I think, are beginning to recognize is that climate change is very real. In a southern state with a deep kind of southern culture that is not always pro-scientific and certainly not always climate friendly, it is an aha moment, I think, for people to recognize that we are in a state where equity and environmental injustice must actually be attended to. That is to say, in the middle of the COVID pandemic, many African American and Brown Latino communities have been deeply, deeply impacted, not just here, but also globally. One of the ways that that's showing up right now is that the lack of infrastructure meeting this climate reality of the winter storms is impacting African American and Brown families differently than it is many families who may have access to an extra home or extra community resources. We will likely see with climate change a kind of weather pattern also in the summer times where the heat index rises in part because the entire planet is rising. That's significant for African American families and communities of color, in part because of the economic injustice, of course, that has been in place for a long time, which of course has links to all kinds of capitalist structures, but then also the embeddedness of white supremacy in this particular country. How do we then to think about not just the future, right, the full future, but even the summer of 2021 and the summer of 2022? And how do we actually begin to put things into place now to raise environmental consciousness among African American communities and certainly communities of color, but then to also raise a consciousness about what's happening and what we can be doing about it now. If in fact we are seeing, as we are in Texas right now, a failure of the entire infrastructure and literally the state not being able to have what it needs to be able to take care of a snowstorm, it's likely that in the summer we will also not be prepared for the heat index rising to a point to be able to take care of the electricity that would be needed to cool the homes of so many millions of people. What can we be doing now is a question. And I think for a theological and certainly a religious lens, it becomes important to incorporate this question about what's happening in faith communities, what conversations are happening about creation and how Black people came to be on the planet, and what is our responsibility of stewardship or the like. Particularly for Eco-Womanism, these questions are important in part because of the logic of domination that is clearly present in most environmental justice work. Unfortunately, the logic of domination that is embedded with white supremacy, of course, and white supremacy certainly is an example of that logic of domination, unfortunately is considered very normal. And so to actually do justice work with the environment means interrupting all of those logics. It's the same logic that puts together the infrastructures that run our state, for example. So we have to think radically different about communal living. We have to think radically different about water supply. We have to think radically different about neighborhoods and urban planning. We have to think radically different about all of these things, not to mention radically different about what is the state of the Black church, the responsibility of the Black church. It is the case that we can no longer afford to think about African American religion in a sole one religion scope. We have to think about interfaith and interreligious dialogue. And I think that project, that conversation is certainly taking us into a hope for Black futures in Black religion.
Dr. Miles?
Yeah, and I really like the piece that, and I'm gonna be quick with my response to this question, the piece that Dr. Harris mentioned about, in part thinking about Black futures, thinking about, right, this summer. And then so future often typically ask us to chart some long time period that's far away from today, where when we think about people who live in precarious conditions, future can be tomorrow morning. And what does that look like? And just thinking about, and I had a response prepared, but Dr. Harris, I just loved her response, where it just has me thinking completely different about the question, where And so Black futures in this context, particularly the moment that we see in Texas, what does it mean to be able to make it to the next day? And I'm a popular culture scholar, and thinking about just the environmental context that we're engaged in now with what's in Texas, with COVID. And so for me, I'm thinking about in what ways then have Black folks did what we've always done, where we've taken the conditions in which we was in, we've taken the small amount of resources we've had, and we've performed humanity, we've survived, and we came together. And so thinking about what's going on in Texas now, where if we get on Twitter, we see Black people organizing, mobilizing, we see people sharing homes because I may have just been one of those lucky ones to have power. We see people coordinating rides to get water, and thinking about the ways in which culture has been a space where, particularly popular culture, if we think about media, how those spaces have been spaces of survival. Yeah. Where, and then so particularly for me, and now I'm thinking about in what ways do we make it to the next day? What ways do we survive today so we can, a future is possible? Where I'm thinking about Keith Layman when he wrote, sometimes it's not just enough for us to lose, right? But white people get mad when we don't lose the way they want us to. And part of what he was pointing to and how I was reading it was, right, these structural conditions, right, have been a constant, these negative structural conditions have been a constant throughout the Black experience in America. And today might be one of my pessimistic days. So it's difficult for me to imagine, right, a near future where these conditions don't manifest in some type of inequitable way. And so for me, I'm thinking about the ways in which music, aesthetics, religion has allowed people to live, survive, and make a way or make a future even desirable in the midst of these things. Where I think about, particularly in relation to my research, Anthony Penn, who talks about beauty and aesthetics in the Black church, where historically Black folks have been denied access to public spaces, where Black physical bodies were only seen and conceptualized as tools. And Black folks could face real physical violence for being presentable, where we typically think being presentable may protect us from violence, but we've seen forms of violence enacted on Black people because this assumption that Black people are trying to assert themselves, Black people or this particular Black person thinks, right, they're more than just what society deems them. And then so church became an aesthetic process also, where it became a space where we not only came and heard the word, but we got to look good doing it. Yeah. And surviving in that manner makes having a future, right, that more advantageous. Because so for me, I think about the aesthetic realm as being a place to where we've found happiness in the moment. And if we can find happiness and beauty in the most monstrous conditions, right, that makes this possibility of dreaming a little bit easier. And so for me, I'm thinking about how even at this particular moment in time, one of the most difficult moments I've been in, right, in my lifetime, where I see people performing and engaging and loving each other in ways that it makes a future, right, not only possible, but it makes it something that's desirable.
Yeah. I would love to add, I mean, thank you so much, Dr. Miles and Dr. Harris. I want to add to this notion about the problem of time, right, that, that we've talked about. And I love, Fred Moten is, one of the scholars du jour, right, that we all evoke. But I think fugitivity might be helpful here in a moment to kind of disrupt the kind of linearity of time, Dr. Miles, that you're pointing to, like the ways in which, I mean, even Stephanie Camp in her kind of classic work reminds us that enslaved Black women had a different relationship to time, right? And the ways in which they were engaging in acts of resistance, both writ large and writ small. And I hear you talking about that in terms of aesthetics. I hear us thinking about that in terms of like, how do we survive in the midst of an environmental catastrophe? And so I want to, kind of continue to push on this notion of of what happens when we are kind of framing the future in this way. And I want to kind of hand it off to Dr. Johnson just for a moment, because I want you to kind of add to this, like, how do you see this category of futurity for in Black studies and in the work that you're now doing in kind of linking, you know, Black studies and humanities to this field of science and technology? Like, where do we land there in a world where we're talking about over here fugitivity, we're talking about here over a time span that may be, you know, just to the next morning? How do you bridge that gap for us in the work that you're doing, Dr. Johnson?
Yeah, no, the futurity is very important. It's becoming, I think, among the scholarly studies that have emerged around Afrofuturism, of the nexus between race and technology, the impact of innovation on global society, has really structured more attention toward issues of agency and possibility. There has been some attention to what's termed Afro-pessimism, or some would say just realism that takes very seriously the scale of challenges that our societies face. And then on a more pragmatic dimension, beyond academic discussions about the future, it's just very clear that we have some significant hurdles before us. I think it's fair to say that inequality is going to be the grand challenge of our time. It is becoming much more difficult to address issues of equitable access to resources. And one of the questions on the horizon is the future of work and the future of wealth, and who's going to become more expendable. How do we leverage the massive amount of wealth creation that is becoming possible through digital technologies, for example, in order to have shared prosperity, as opposed to the same narrative of deepening inequality. Those are very serious challenges that certainly scholars need to engage with, and that practitioners across multiple domains in our systems of healthcare, as we see now, right? The equitable access to having some recourse to a global pandemic. We are failing at that. The pandemic has just made it easier to recognize how unequal our society is. And so we have to have a paradigm shift in the way we create wealth and get to shared prosperity. Because right now our course is set to deepening that inequality. So the nexus for me, the connection is really about structuring more of a public impact through the scholarship that happens. One of the exciting things that we're seeing now is something called public interest technology. Darren Walker, who's leading the Ford Foundation, has been very focused on this issue and has partnered with the New America Foundation to try to develop concrete ways for our higher ed institutions to help us to get to a more equitable future through the way we train future talent. That was going to end up determining a lot of the leadership and the policies and the implementations of the innovation systems that are going to define our future, not in a reductive way, but certainly in an important way that requires us to pay attention. And so I think the more work we can do as humanists to understand the need for more social justice oriented leadership and training and preparation in the future of talent to participate in deciding what that innovation society is going to look like and how the wealth creation is going to happen and what steps we need to take to get to shared prosperity. I think the better position we will be as humanists to execute our work in a way that can hopefully transform those futures away from some of the most drastic dystopian scenarios that are possible, and to have a different set of possibilities to take us to a more equitable set of outcomes.
Yeah, No, that's really helpful. I want to kind of move us into this next question about, because I want to just kind of highlight our panelists for a minute as well, because I want Corey, Dr. Miles, I want you to tell folks about how do you use the word trap music, and I'm going to assume that some people on today don't actually know what that is, and so I want you to break down for our listeners just a moment. Kind of how are you thinking about trap? Like, what is trap music? How are you thinking about that? And how is that pushing the field of Black studies or American studies in some ways, right? To kind of begin your work or to begin your analysis there. And then Dr. Harris, I wanted you just to go one step further too with this kind of notion of like, what does, in lay person's terms, what is Eco-Womanism and how does that tie in with a more equitable future that Dr. Johnson is highlighting, right? Like, how do these interventions that you both are articulating tie back into what Dr. Johnson is kind of talking about as the broader frame? And then we'll get to the Black church question. I want to get to the Black church. I don't want to skip that question before we start taking questions from folks. But go ahead, Dr. Miles. Like, break down trap music for us today, and on February 18th in the middle of Black History Month. Tell us what's going on.
I just love the way you asked the question. Now I feel like I have to do justice to it. So trap music, as I would write about, is originated in Atlanta. Songs with hi-hats, heavy 808s to give it bass, and the content is generally around guns and drugs, right? And then so that's kind of, if we think about just the musicological structural template of trap music, I mean, that's what's in it. Guns, drugs, those type of lyrics, hi-hats, 808s to give it a rough, gritty, dark vibe. And so what I'm doing is really thinking about how in the era of policing, the era in surveillance, the era in mass incarceration, how did music on criminality become the #1 sound, not in just America, but the world, right? If we're thinking about, like, how do these two coexist? How do they develop together? And so part of then what I do is try to develop a framework then to read trap music as something more than just about advocating for guns and drugs. And if I can develop a framework to read that music, in what ways does that framework also give us a better reading of, right, oppression of people who've been socially positioned as criminal? And so I will argue that we understand the world and Black people through a carceral frame. Blackness carries the mark of criminality. And so for me, I'm thinking about, in my frame is just that you can't really understand music based off solely text. So the lyrics may point to guns and drugs, but you have to also think about the texture of music. So how does it make you feel? What are the beats? What are the drums? What are the ad libs? And what parts of the song does a person sing? And so what's the vibe of it? And you also have to think about the context of music. Who's producing this? Who's making it? What's their economic structure? What is their relationship to the state? And when we understand the text, the texture, and context all together, we get a better reading of trap music. So it's not then just about songs about guns and drugs, but it may very well be that. So some of them are just that, but I don't think we know that without a larger frame. And then I said, okay, if we can try to see the beauty in trap music, how does that frame allow us to read Blackness differently? And then so in America, if we just think about Blackness, right? Well, if we just look at legal text, so like me, I have an American birth certificate, American passport. So legally I have claim to America. But the texture of my experience is one of anxiousness. I'm nervous. I feel like I'm in a precarious position. The context of my experience is one of being police. Doesn't matter how many degrees I got, it doesn't stop, right, the structural position I'm in. And so for me, it's thinking about then using trap music really just as a frame into how we've criminalized Blackness in and of itself. And to have a better reading of that provides us a more nuanced frame of understanding Black experiences and Black performances in general. And so for me, then trap music becomes a window into a larger process. And so for me, it's thinking through then, what does this offer thinking about the future of Black people? And part then what it's attempting to do is we need a new frame for understanding the Black experience. where maybe legal text, maybe surface level readings don't even tell us what this song is about. So it's not difficult to imagine that these surface levels readings misunderstand the context and experience of Blackness as a whole. And for me, then it calls for abolition, it calls for technologies, it calls for frameworks that go beyond just these legal ramifications to Blackness. So how do we change the texture of an experience? How do we forge emotional citizenship where Black people actually feel like they belong? How do we change the context in ways that legal documents haven't done it? And so for me, trap music becomes one way in saying that we need to be more nuanced, not just in the popular culture sphere, but also how we understand lived experiences in general, if we want a better future. But I'm still not sure if American society wants a better future for its citizens.
Yeah. Take that to the next level for us, Dr. Harris, about kind of thinking about eco-womanism and like, is there a question or like, as Dr. Johnson was saying, is there a pessimistic strain that kind of informs the critique and analysis and this understanding or engagement with a broader or a different future?
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, Dr. Miles, your last question there, I think whether or not America is ready for a different kind of future is an important one. I hear the echo of Amanda Gordon there profoundly in terms of whether or not we're actually ready to move into democracy, which is interesting, right? Because I think when we think about obviously the echoes of Frederick Douglass asking so many poets, Langston Hughes, et cetera, the question about whether or not America is even possible, there is a really important a place to land there before we start thinking about the future. And I'll go kind of practical here, but then also talk a little bit about eco-womanism. As a scholar in African-American studies and Africana thought, right now I am doing work that I want to do, that I desire to do, but work that I didn't think that I would be doing. As a trained ethicist out of Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York, I actually really did believe that I would be working primarily in the uncovering of resources for womanist thought and womanist theology, and being able to build a career on just staying there. That is to say, in the gift of being able to go through numerous slave narratives, being able to go through the powerful work of Black women writers, and to spend a 20 to 30-year career just enjoying that. The truth is, we have needed the wisdom of that work for living out each and every day. And so, like many African-American and Africana scholars, I too have turned more activist than I actually intended to. Some of that is because of my own theological leanings and my own sense of call, et cetera. But some of it is also because of the questions that students are bringing are, how do I survive and understand the framework of white supremacy that's embedded in my higher education? And how and why am I paying for this? Is it the case that I have become so complicit in a capitalist system, believing in a deep sense, right, of inferiority, that even the learning that I do in this particular classroom won't be enough to actually get me a job? When you think of yourself as a teacher and as a scholar with those questions before you as kind of life questions, then I think your outlook on creating your own scholarship changes. And Dr. Johnson, you were mentioning this earlier in terms of this kind of line and maybe not kind of synergy between being an activist and being a scholar. More and more of us in this generation, certainly of Black religion and religious thought, are thinking about our work differently, not just for the publication of some eyes and journal entries and articles, but how do we actually get this conversation to the public, to people, to Black people, to empower them, to inspire them, to remind them that the resilience that comes with African diasporic peoples is in fact real, and that even moving from one day to another is not just a feat and a common occurrence, but it is a miracle. I'm reminded of the work of Lucille Clifton here to celebrate with me, because every day something has tried to kill me and fail. So it's important to recognize that we're living in a moment where I think African and African American people are sitting in conversation, ready to have the conversation about democracy, but I don't know that everyone else is ready. And here I'm talking about white people specifically. I'm not sure that all white communities are actually ready to envision the democracy that Black people have known that they deserve. And that means that the conversations around inclusiveness and equity actually have to, in some cases, start at a very, very elementary level. In higher education institutions, many of us are doing the work of inclusive excellence, as my institution is. And in some pockets, there are scholars and administrators who are ready to go with a new set of policies, with a new frame of how to be equitable. And some of those policies lead to more of a frame of reparations rather than reconciliation. But there are other pockets in the institution that are radically traditional and built on the kind of investment in a white supremacist frame whereby tenure promotion processes, for example, remain stoic. They do not change. And the evaluation of a scholar of color then becomes difficult and problematic, but it stays problematic instead of a policy change to actually take a look at implicit bias, et cetera, et cetera. So the question around whether or not we are ready for a future is an important one for us to sit in and sit with, because, and this is kind of grandmother's wisdom, if the people are not ready, then you might as well spend your time taking care of your business, taking care of your community. You might as well spend the time feeding your children and taking care of your home and taking care of the people who live around you, making sure that people do have food to eat, water, clean water to drink, people have access. And even if you cannot take care of the entire planet, you certainly take care of, in the words of Alice Walker and her mother, right, that she remembers so deeply, take care of all of the children who are around you and making sure that there is food in those mouths. So that is a part of the question, I think, in terms of where we are. And that means choice, that many of us as scholars and thinkers and students right now have a choice about whether or not to continue to spend energy and invest energy in these hard discourses to plant the seed and the trail for true equity. Or is it the case that you're in a situation or an institutional context where that conversation isn't going anywhere right now, and it's better for you to finish your dissertation or finish that next book, and to focus and ingrain yourself really in the work of lifting up African and Africana voices for the encouragement and empowerment of often Black and Brown communities, and that those paths can lead not necessarily to a tenure track job, right? Those paths can lead to a different kind of scholarship and a different kind of public theological understanding and a different kind and a different being, right? So there are those realities. Let me say just a word about Eco-Womanism, in part because it too is a very important Black futures example of scholarship. Eco-Womanism really is an approach to environmental justice that necessitates attention to race, class, and gender, and other forms of systemic oppression that have actually created African-American life and put those lives in deep jeopardy, made most African-American and Black communities extremely vulnerable when climate injustice takes place and when we do see the impact of climate change. That being said, it is a part not just of environmental ethics and the kind of framework that comes from that particular kind of intellectual discourse, but it's also finds home in womanist thought and womanist ethics and theology. So the kind of origins and reasons for womanism to come to bear in the first place, which was to really create a space for the women of color, for African-American women and their theologies to be named and to be validated, to be the center of theological reflection. Those origins, those roots are also a part of Eco-Womanism. When we think about all of the powerful African-American and Africana women who have been a part of climate change movements around the world, Wangari Maathai, so many others, it is the case that these voices and their strategies have actually not been lifted up in the normative environmental movement. They have been in some ways devalued, in part because the women who came up with the ideas, the women who embodied the genius, were people of African descent. So there's a sense in which the racism that is so prevalent throughout the entire discourse of environmental ethics is actually precluding the solutions, that possible solutions for climate change itself. When racism has that much power to be able to literally silence what could potentially save people's lives, then it's worth a field actually taking another step back and recognizing that the silence may in fact not just be a practice of violence, which is unfortunately very normative in the academy, but it actually is violence for several generations to come. And it's violence not just for a particular group of people, but it's actually violence for everyone and everything, the planet herself. So that's a little bit about eco-womanism and where the origins are and how important it is. And I think we will continue to see eco-womanism as a really important method and framework that can be used by a variety of different folks and people, but certainly is used to uplift the kind of genius that comes out of women of African descent.
Thank you so much. I want to jump in. We have a lot of questions in the Q&A, and I know that one of the things that we wanted to get in, I'm going to throw this to Dr. Johnson, and I'm going to let him start off, but I'm going to try to build some of these questions in together, because everyone knows, or a lot of you who are listening today saw the PBS Black Church series that's going on, that was led by Dr. Skip Gates from Harvard, but we also wanted to kind of bring that topic into our conversation today. Like, how does this question of Black futures relate to the Black church, or the end of the Black church, or the future of the Black church? And we have, a scholar and a number of scholars here, but, Dr. Johnson, you've written The Myth of Ham, you've written the African-American religions, you've thought about this. So I want you to kind of unpack for folks a little bit what that means. And then, Dr. Chereau was asking, can you also speculate on some of the other forms of Black religion and spirituality today, right? So we often kind of focus in on the Black church, right? And she wants to kind of help us expand this. What are the prominent forms of Africana futurism that appear in religion, ritual, and sacred arts, and so forth, outside of the Black church, right? She also says, please address the rise of Afrofuturism and the current appeal of the dystopic, the horror, and the Black Gothic, right? So this is a large question. So Dr. Johnson, you can start us off, and then I want us to all kind of play around with this question of the Black church for a minute, right? What does that future look like? Does it give us the ability to move beyond a kind of a simplistic or binary definition of it?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so many directions to go with that. For the sake of time, I'll gesture toward one, the work of Aisha Beliso de Jesus. Her Electrical Santeria is a study of Santeria religion that really draws on the ways the experience of Santeria can be interpreted as electrical currents, as electrical presences and movements. And it's a fascinating way of thinking through one of the Africana religious traditions to try to understand things like materiality and what's real, and how to understand the nature of objects. If you think about electricity, it's not something that you could say set on the table and weigh to see its mass, but it is a physical reality, and yet it is also useful for thinking about what people try to refer to when they're talking about spiritual energy and spiritual transfer. So that's just one example of an Africana religion that is engaging with, or that has been engaged in order to try to discern some of its technological import to get at some of these deeper questions. There are other dimensions to Dr. Chereau's questions there, but I'll stop there for the sake of time and refer to our other panelists.
And I want to take another question, and kind of, you can continue on that, Dr. Miles, but I wanted to add in, Dr. Gilpin had a question. He said, the language of MLK is laden with temporal images. This goes back to the Black church, right? Now is the time, I have a dream, where do we go from here? The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards some specific time and place, right? And this question was asking, do these ideas on the temporal have any relevance in our present circumstance? And, again, I guess we can kind of build that into the Black church. Does the Black church rely too heavily, right, on this category of time that you critiqued at the beginning of our conversation, Dr. Miles? So jump in there and talk to me a little bit about that.
And I think that's a beautiful question where, right, I think Dr. King throughout his career was, right, critiquing time, where we think about his letter from Birmingham jail, where everybody's asking him to wait. And he goes through his space, well, we're in these type of conditions, right? In what ways is waiting just another form of injustice? Or we can think about Dr. King says sometimes the past isn't yet the past, right? And then so we see layered through different speeches and different texts where he's calling into question, I guess, this linearity of time, this assumption that just because minutes and hours have elapsed, it doesn't mean we're in a different position. And so he's thinking then about, at least me thinking alongside Dr. King, where in what ways then has time, right, been used as a rationalization to explain away certain types of structural disadvantage? And in what ways then does the idea of future become another type of rationalization or justification for enduring what you endure today? Where we can see, and this is me bringing in some rap artists, but even just other folks, where we see people saying, well, I don't want to wait until I get to heaven to get my paradise. And I think sometimes it's a fair, right, critique to say, I matter enough today. And I do see Dr. King then laying the groundwork for thinking about ways to which to reimagine time. And then so if we're thinking about Black future, then as a method, then for me it's thinking about then what does this methodology equip or call upon us to do? And then so for me, it becomes in many ways thinking then about time, about past, about future, as both, right, social constructs mediated through the current systems in which we're in. And into Black future, if Black people live in an anti-Black society that predetermines Black death, where I'm thinking about Black death as being a normative part of our society, meaning that the future should not include Black people. And if it does, it's because the system didn't work quite as well as it should have. A couple of folks kind of slipped through that system. Then Black futures, right, as a framework becomes a way in which to critique time in and of itself, where Black people have been positioned as ahistorical. Oh, well, Black people were better off enslaved because, right, they didn't have culture, they didn't have history. All right, so slavery was justified by pulling Black people out of a historical timeline. And then we use this possibility of some grand future or this idea of progress. And then this is what I see from Dr. King, where he's always talking about progress. And we saw it from Malcolm X too, where Malcolm X says, I mean, you giving me what I already deserve isn't progress. Where this linearity narrative, in ways we see different historical folks in critiquing that, and then Black future then becomes a way in which to not only chart a better what's yet to come, but can we reimagine the stories that were once told about who we were in the past?
No, that's fascinating. I want to pose a question from the Q&A to Dr. Harris, and this is particularly reminiscent of your attention toward the need for engaging across religious traditions and boundaries, and thinking about the futurity and some of the generationalism. So this question asks about it's referring to the Judas and Black Messiah film that has come out. And this viewer was reminded of how important it is to have youthful leadership for any movement focusing on social change. So they're asking about your thoughts of how you would see the movement to use wisdom and grace of the elders to ensure that younger leaders can actually play a role in the future of these movements. So what should that look like, and what are your thoughts about that?
Thanks for the question. Thanks so much, Dr. Johnson. It's an important one, I think, that many Black churches are grappling with, especially after the documentary. Many Black churches across the United States of America, and I suppose globally, have always received critique about the fact that we have never paid attention or not enough attention to youth. There are certainly great examples of those who are. I'm thinking of Frederick Douglass Haynes, the third at Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, certainly Trinity in Chicago with Dr. Moss, and certainly the kind of legacy of the Samuel Dwight Proctor Conference. These are organizations that are connected to, and they themselves are, Black churches that lift up the voices of younger people and see them as elders, right? So there, and some of that I think is in part because these Black churches are particularly open and embody an African-centered nature. That is to say that there is a sense in which there is a kind of practice of indigenous Black African religion happening even as those churches are also Black and Christian. There's a deep, deep commitment to the fluidity, but also the plurality of all of Black religiosity in these particular spaces. They understand themselves not to be spaces of Christian doctrine and upholding Christian doctrine without any question, but they understand themselves to be truly embodiments of Black liberation theology. And as we all know, that legacy unfolds in ways that it goes way beyond Christianity. It goes way beyond Islam. It goes way beyond any kind of mainstream religion, but it recognizes that all of African peoples practice a variety of different religious traditions in their Blackness. I happened to have been on a wonderful conference, Black and Buddhist, earlier today, a summit that's being hosted by an extraordinary group of people really celebrating the book that has just come out, Black and Buddhist. I want to lift up the work of Cheryl Dries and IUPUI here, in part because there is a way in which within the practice of Buddhism, many African-American practitioners are now coming to the same question that Dr. Cohn often asked all of his students: what is Black about your theology? And here, for many practitioners of Buddhism, the question is, what do you believe about your Blackness and its impact on the Dharma? What do you believe about your Blackness and its impact on Buddhism? And how do you practice Black Buddhism, particularly in a space in the United States of America where the history of Buddhism is webbed on kind of whiteness, and even the understanding of the racial components of Buddhism, right? This is a tradition that is not coming out of Europe. It is not coming out of white European understanding. It's coming out of Asia. And there is a sense in which there are erasures of Asian legacy and heritage that are embedded in the practice of Buddhism in the United States of America. What then does it mean to be a person of African descent and to find peace and value and mindfulness in Black Buddhism, and to be able to reclaim that religion for the empowerment of Blackness? We have a long way to go in recognizing the deep, deep humanity, but the sacredness of all religiosity and the sacredness of Blackness, and being able to create spaces for all of those conversations and the ring shout and the dancing and the singing and the songs, and to hear the voices of ancestors who practice a number of different religions in our own hearts and in our own selves and in our own voices. To create the space, I think that's the charge of religious communities in this day.
Yeah, no, I love that. We have about 2 minutes left, and so I wanted to throw a question just to Dr. Johnson, and then I want to give everybody like 15 seconds to add or to expound or to just give the folks that are listening a chance to take something away with you. But Dr. Johnson, there was a question out there from Dr. Friesen who was asking, is there a future of the Black religion, right, or Black religiosity that really doesn't include as much of the Black church, right? I wondered what you were thinking as you were watching or not watching the PBS series last night about its hyper focus on Black church, when your work and so many other works have kind of highlighted that's a limiting frame in some ways, right? So so talk to me a little bit about that, and then I want to just throw to everybody, really we only have 15 seconds to kind of close out, and anything that we want to leave for folks to think about as we end for today.
Yeah, sure. I think that it's the one version of a quick answer to that question is that if one thinks beyond the boundaries of the United States, I think it's a lot easier to appreciate the breadth and diversity of religious traditions beyond Black churches. And even if you think of the most dominant form of Christianity in the Western Hemisphere among Black people has been Catholicism. And that's just always been the case. It's just how it's worked. In the United States, it's a different story. But the most populous Black country, or the most populous country in the Western Hemisphere for Black people is Brazil. And historically, most of that Christianity has been Catholicism. But if you look beyond the US, it's very clear that there's not that focus on the Black church as the end all be all. Doesn't mean Christianity is not important and vibrant outside the US. Of course it is. Yeah. I think this Black church focus is very particular to the US.
Well, I want to give, I know we have like 30 seconds left, so I want to give Corey and Dr. Miles and Dr. Harris 10 seconds to close us out, and then I will give some instructions for folks as we end today's fascinating conversation about reimagining Black futures. Dr. Miles and then Dr. Harris, you can close us out for today.
I guess in my 10 seconds, I'll briefly quote Nikki Giovanni when she says, when Black people didn't have cars, we would walk, and the world tried to imitate the dexterity of our feet. And she talks about how Black beauty is a testament that the Black spirit always prevails. And so I don't know what the future will look like, but we're gonna make it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Miles.
I say thank you so much for all of you for the conversation. Keep dreaming. I think Black dreams are important. They carry a powerful energy in and of themselves. And I think we have to do what we can and what we must to keep our own hearts in full light.
Well, I want to thank you all so much, Dr. Harris, from calling in and joining us from Texas, Dr. Miles from Baltimore, Maryland, my hometown, and Dr. Johnson from Blacksburg, Virginia, for joining us today for this fascinating conversation on religion and reimagining Black futures. We only touched the tip of the surface this afternoon, and I hope that you all will join us again as we continue these conversations throughout the rest of the year. After today's webinar, you'll receive a short survey. Please fill that out. Let us know your thoughts, your feedbacks, topics that you would like for us to cover. Please also join us next month on March 18th at 3 p.m. Eastern for our religion and climate change, where we'll be discussing climate change and its impact on the world and how religious communities respond to them. Again, you can find all of these conversations and episodes on our website and our YouTube channel. I want to thank you again for joining us, and I want to thank again our panelists for a great conversation. You all have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next month.